Well, this is my last video on the source material for Hearts of Steel, and what we're going to talk about today is the surface actions that Nubian was involved in and some of the material from there. In the first instance, Nubian was deployed to Norway, in particular for the deployment of troops and the evacuation of them from the port of Namsos, and a useful book that gives a very good perspective from the Royal Navy point of view is by Captain Donald McIntyre, called Narvik. You can still get hold of it. It's fairly common book, and it does go through the campaign, and in particular the campaign around Namsos in some detail, and not only the Navy but from the Army as well. So Narvik is a useful book to give you a good broad brush on the Norwegian campaign. In charge of forces, the army forces in that area at the time, was a very interesting fellow, fantastic gentleman, old school gentleman, called Sir Adrian Carpenter Wyatt, and he was the holder of a VC. He'd been injured numerous times. He'd lost an eye, been shot in the head, lost a hand. He was a big hunting, shooting and fishing man, which interested me no end. In fact, he was injured so many times that the hospital that he convalesced in had a set of pyjamas and bedroom attire made for him, especially for him, because he was in there so often. What was also interesting for me was that during that command and control phase that Nubian had during the campaign, he was aboard Nubian quite a lot. He was sending signals back to the UK, back to England, and to the Admiralty and the like to run the campaign. So, yeah, he would have been familiar to the crew of Nubian. Heading off to the Mediterranean, if I talk briefly about the National Archives, I managed to find a document which was the report into the loss of the sinking of HMS Mohawk, which was Nubian's sister ship, and both of them, including Jervis and Janus, were involved in the sinking of Italian convoy in April 1941, and that particular document gave me a brilliant source to describe what the action was like from each of those ships from the captain's perspective, and not only from the captain's perspective but some of the crews on board the individual ships, because they did call witnesses from some of the stokers and the other senior members of crew to look into why Mohawk was sunk, which I won't go into too much details, I'll spoil it, but that was, and it was an incredible piece for describing what happens when a ship starts to go down, especially a warship. So that was a really good, worthwhile trip up to the National Archives just for that particular one. And finally, a quick chat about Admiral Cunningham, ABC Cunningham's book, A Sailor's Odyssey. This really gave me the view from the head of command. You know, he was in charge of the Eastern Mediterranean Fleet. He was reporting into Admiral Pound, who was First Sea Lord, who obviously was reporting into Whitehall and to Churchill. And so some have said this is a dull book, but it is not. For me, it's not at all. It was an incredible book. And whilst he goes into some detail, he does give you the reasoning behind what the decisions were, and why they were made. In particular, what I found fantastic was his discussion around the French fleet at Mers El Kabir and Operation Catapult, where they were the Royal Navy had shelled the base and sunk several of their ships, and had to put the fleet out of action. What I hadn't realised was that a very similar thing was occurring in Alexandria at the time. There were certain elements of the French fleet in Alexandria with the Royal Navy, and that was a fairly close run thing. But through diplomacy, Cunningham managed to get a peaceful resolution to that, which is often overlooked. And also the reasoning behind it all. I mean, we have to remember that France had been taken over, particularly by the Germans, whilst Pétain was in charge. From a French perspective, he was pandering to Hitler at the time, and you have this very powerful Royal Navy from France with some very powerful battleships that are suddenly could be in German hands and used with the Axis powers. So they had to be neutralised somehow, and for the captains of those ships, for the French captains of those ships, that was a big problem for them as well. Whilst some of them would have had definite sympathies with the Allies, they've seen their country overrun, and they would desperately probably wanted to join them to boot the Germans out. On the other hand, they were still French. They still had a government, and they had a loyalty, shall we say, to their country in that respect. So, if they had just gone off and joined the British, then in the eyes of their government, they would have been traitors. So they were really in a very, very difficult position, whether their hearts said they wanted to work with the Allies or not. And so I was really, really fascinated by that bit, and I hope you are too. So that concludes the last of the videos. The book should be out fairly soon. I'm now talking to you from January, excuse the dog, the back end of January 2023. I'm hoping it'll be released in February, maybe March, and I hope that these give you a flavour of what the book is about, and that you'll go away and read a copy. Thanks very much for listening.